So, wrapping up 2022 Watches and Wonders, there were a lot of new watches that came out from a bunch of different brands. Obviously, Rolex and Tudor came out with a few new watches, and a lot of their watches sort of got me thinking about their relationship. Obviously, Rolex and Tudor are under the same brand. They are actually separate brands. They're under the Hans Wilsdorf Foundation. However, there is obviously a relationship between the two brands, and you can see that through the watches that actually came out from Tudor. And it sort of begs the question, is Rolex actually recreating a heritage line of watches within the Tudor brand? If you look at their releases from this year, last year, and previous years, it really is a very good question. We're going to get into that right now. For Watches and Wonders 2022, Rolex and Tudor came out with a bunch of new watches. Some of them very interesting, some of them controversial. However, Tudor are getting high praises on the release of its new Tudor Black Bay Pro, a 39mm Traveler's GMT with a fixed steel 24-hour bezel. They also released another GMT in the Black Bay lineup of watches. That's a 41mm version, and it has a two-tone root beer variation, which gets the same movement as the other watch that I just mentioned. However, it's two-tone format, so yellow gold tone and stainless steel. They did this again with their chronograph, so the chronograph that already exists. They've come out with a two-tone version of that. This one is actually getting a gold dial with black sub-registers. All three of these watches look great. They really are doing a very good job. However, these three releases really got me thinking, are Rolex trying to reconstruct their iconic vintage models within the Tudor lineup of watches? It seems that Rolex are making essentially an homage, a lineup of homage watches to many of their more notable watches from the past, and they're doing this in the Tudor lineup. Now, I know Tudor and Rolex are technically two separate companies. However, they sit under the Hans Wilsdorf Foundation, so they do have some connection. So what I think is going on here is that Rolex, having influence over Tudor, are making them or working with them on creating recreations of their past watches. Iconic watches from the Rolex lineup in the Tudor lineup. You can see a lot of the similarities that I'm going to be pointing out. These are extremely popular watches that obviously Rolex no longer make. They are usually very rare or very highly priced on the vintage market. So these are really unattainable watches for a lot of people. And if you like the look, there is really no way of doing this. Something also to note, Rolex as a brand seem not to look back. They don't look back on their history. And what I mean by this, they look forward. They only sort of incrementally improve their watches. They don't reissue watches at all. A great example of this is Omega. You can buy a modern Seamaster, like a modern Seamaster 300 Professional, or a Planet Ocean or something like that. Or if you want, you can go to their heritage lineup of watches, and they only have reissues there. So you can get a reissue of a Speedmaster, a Seamaster, it doesn't matter. Most of their watches have been recreated in this line of watches. They have a historic heritage lineup that they only sell reissues through. Rolex don't really do this. Are Tudor becoming Rolex's line of heritage reissues? Let's look at a few of the models that I am talking about. Now, the models that I just mentioned, the third watch that I actually just mentioned was a two-tone version of a chronograph with a gold dial and black sub-registers. If you go back to the Rolex Daytona, the 16532, this gets a Zenith movement in it. So it is a Zenith Daytona. It's an El Primero Daytona. These were available in the 90s. They came in at 40 millimeters, basically the exact same size as the watch that I was just mentioning. It gets a champagne dial, that gold dial with black sub-registers. And like I said, it was available in the 80s and 90s. These are very expensive now. If you want one, you're going to spend around $25,000 for one. But if you really want one and you want to buy one new, you could basically buy this in the Tudor lineup of watches now. They just made it available for 2022. Next on the list, let's take it back to the 1950s or the 1960s. If you want a GMT-master, you're going to go and get maybe a 6542, something like that. It's going to have a Pepsi bezel on it. And if you look at the Tudor lineup right now, that is basically the 41mm GMT in the Black Bay line of watches. That is essentially a reissue of that watch. It's an homage to the original Rolex 1950s, 1960s GMT Masters. Very, very close in looks, and you could see that from the card that I actually put up, and I'll throw pictures of the watches standing side by side so you can see what I'm talking about. Then the Rolex GMT-master 2, the reference 16713, 1970s, 1980s. That's a root beer version. Again, another watch that was actually released this year for 2022 from Tudor, the root beer version of the Black Bay 41. Very, very similar. Again, sort of a reissue of that 1970s, 1980s 16713. Then there's the Rolex Explorer 2, reference 1655. That's the 70s and 80s. That was basically the Explorer 2 that was available. Now, obviously, with the Black Bay Pro 39, that is a reissue of that watch. So we're looking very, very closely at these, and a lot of them look very, very similar. The Rolex Big Crown, reference 6538, aka the James Bond Submariner from the 1950s and 60s. It has that little red triangle at the 12 o'clock on the bezel. Really looks a lot like the Black Bay 58. Black Bay 58, a very good looking watch, but a clear homage to this Rolex Big Crown 6538. Basically, and there's a few other models in the Submariner lineup that this sort of homages as well. Last but not least, the Rolex Daytona, reference 6263 or 64, better known as the Paul Newman Daytona. Obviously, the Tudor chronograph, that was actually released last year, sometime last year or the year before. They came out with a Panda version, has black subdials, white dial, looks very much like a Paul Newman Daytona. They know what they were doing. Tudor came out with this watch. It's an homage to the Paul Newman Daytona. If you want something that looks kind of similar from a brand that is almost associated with the same watch, why not go the Tudor direction? These aren't very expensive watches either, so essentially what they're doing is they're creating a heritage lineup in the Tudor lineup of watches. Not a bad idea. Many of their original designs, like the North Flag, and that's a reissue of a vintage Tudor Ranger, and the reissue of their vintage Advisor Alarm, which I absolutely love. These watches get discontinued, and the reason why they get discontinued is because they are really not popular watches with collectors, with people who love Tudor, and that's because they don't look like your traditional Rolex. A lot of these watches go to the wayside. People don't buy them. The P01 is another watch, a watch that I actually own, and I bring this watch up pretty often. This was actually a Rolex, and they came out with it in the Tudor lineup. They actually made two versions of it. They made a Rolex version, they made a Tudor version. Tudor is the one that actually reissued it. So again, it just proves that Tudor is sort of the market for Rolex to reissue watches. It's a very interesting concept, but when you look at all these watches side by side, you can see that there is a lot of similarities between these watches design-wise. They are faithful recreations with the Tudor name on them. Not a bad thing, and I'm not dogging Tudor for this. I own Tudor. I love Tudors. I think they're really good-looking watches, but it's kind of fun that you could see this, and I don't know if a lot of people are really pointing this out. I think some people are, some people aren't. Some people don't even know that these watches are homages to actual Rolex models from the past. Tell me what you guys think down in the comments below. It's a really interesting sort of concept what Rolex and Tudor are doing, and there's sort of their relationship. Even though they're two separate companies, obviously there's heavy influence from Rolex in Tudor. They're not their own company by any means, even though people think that they are. They are not. But tell me what you guys think in the comments down below. I want to hear from you guys. Please also don't forget to like, subscribe, hit that bell icon. It is super helpful for the channel, and I very much appreciate it. Please follow me on Instagram. My Instagram is WatchChrisBlog, all one word. I have some links in the description. Those links are to Amazon. If you click those links and buy anything, it helps support the channel. It doesn't cost you anything extra. However, I very much appreciate it. Anyway, thank you for logging on. I'll catch you guys in the next video.